Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here with B'nai Lappi. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm seeing I'm having a little technical issue with my camera being in the wrong place. So hold on. There it goes. Okay. Um, I'm pretty good. It's been a week. um,
Yes, it has.
the in terms of relevancy, well, in terms of relevancy to everything, but in terms of also relevancy to our work, I mean, there have been two momentous events the past week. One was the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I think on so many levels, including ones that I can't quite articulate, it's so relevant to what we do here. Um, I think that how people talk about how Ruth Bader Ginsburg, actually, in Justice Souter's uh, little, very short, I think it was two sentences, kind of statement after she died, he said something like she's one of the few Supreme Court justices who was great in the law, before she became a Supreme Court justice. Like her greatness, like Thurgood Marshall was sort of recognized by putting her on the Supreme Court, but her greatness was actually achieved before she came on the court and after. But that she was actually a giant of American law who then was elevated. And so it feels, I don't know where that fits, if there are particular characters that, in the Talmud that description fits to, or if it's something to think about how, when you put someone like that on the court, you're putting on a judge. Yes, of course they will try to be even-handed and fair to the case, but you also know you're putting on a certain kind of judge who's already shown what kind of a judge or what kind of a person they are, what kind of a thinker they are. So,
Yeah.
so
It,
yeah.
yeah, and I, I, I find it so sad and frustrating that she really was thwarted in her efforts to be as visionary and to have her vision actually play out on the Supreme Court the way it was able to before.
Yeah.
Um, and you know what I've been
Yeah.
thinking a lot about? She was aware of and vocal about the way in which her work was a playing out of Jewish values.
Mm.
She talked about that. She's recognized for that. She wasn't apologetic about it. She really, in spite of being alienated from Jewish life and turned off, in her own telling, by the ways in which she couldn't, for example, have a minyan of the women in her family when her mother died, and she was, really turned off to organized religion. She really felt that what she did was Jewish. Um, but what I'm guessing she may not have realized was that I think she embodied the Talmudic approach to law and
Mm.
change. The way she talked about and lived out a kind of gracious, calm, um, persuasive in a gentle way kind of law. Her quotes about disagree agreeably and fight what you care about, but do it in a way that others will come along with you. If I had to boil down the entire project of the Talmud, it would be that. It would be the rabbis in the Talmud are saying, this is how you make radical, sometimes necessary radical change. You have to convince people that it's rooted in the foundations and the principles of the tradition that they already believe in, and it's not anything new, it's just a further playing out. And she did that intuitively. I don't think she learned it from the Talmud, and I'm guessing she didn't learn it in isolation. I have this idea that when Talmud is working, it permeates the culture in such a way that someone who's never opened the Talmud thinks and behaves in ways influenced by that Talmudic culture. Um, and I think she's a person who was influenced by that, and she knew that. And I don't think it was just her mother telling her in isolation, because I don't think her mother got that idea in isolation. The
Mhm.
idea that, don't let your emotions overcome you. I don't know.
Mm.
So for
Well,
me, she's like a walking Talmud.
yeah, and more to say about it. I do think it's also one reason why she might not have known or thought of herself as in that tradition was because as a woman she wasn't taught. She wouldn't have the opportunity to study Talmud in that way. She wouldn't have, in a previous generation, even if maybe her family wasn't so religious that they would have. But I mean, even if they had been, it's likely that she wouldn't have learned, and I mean, I think that's part of what's changing today. That's part of what this show is about. So that's a good thing. The other thing that happened in the last week was the decision by the Attorney General of Kentucky not to prosecute the police for the killing of Breonna Taylor, which we can go through a very long discussion of the specifics of that, and we've talked about the obligation to protest and take that seriously. I think the one thing that I'd like to say beyond everything that we've been saying, for a very long time now, about this case in particular, that everybody's been saying, is it feels like there's something Talmudic to talk about or to have in the back of our mind, which is the moment when the bad deed is done, right? I think we naturally imagine that the moment of to pay attention to here is the moment when the police shot and Breonna Taylor was killed. The real moment, it seems to me, from what I understand about the story, was that they should never have been sent there in the first place. That the person they were looking for was already in jail. And even if that hadn't been the case, that to send people at 12:30 at midnight, to somebody's house, that doesn't happen in the wealthy suburbs, where the white folks live. So that there's so many ways that even if you can try to justify in some way, even if you could, I'm saying, even if one could tried to justify, well, they were being shot at. That's not the only moment in the story that matters, and I think that part of what the Talmud, at least for me, sensitizes us to is to really examine deeply and more deeply, and that sometimes you find the real crime, so to speak, and in reality at a different point than you might think, and I think that here in this case, it's revealing of a much deeper societal ill of the cavalier treatment of Black lives, and that's why Black Lives Matter is a fair way to put it, because it's not, somebody said about, well, how do you respond to the all lives matter? It's like, well, what do you go to a breast cancer meeting and say all cancers matter? That's what we're talking about here, because there's a concern that if there's not it's not a claim that not all lives matter. It's a concern that this kind of life doesn't matter. And we're saying this better matter just as much, and that's what this is about. And that's what I think that this story at so many points, so many decision points, shows that it doesn't, that Black lives don't matter into the system, and that needs to change. So I think what I'm saying
Absolutely.
here is just that we're dedicating our learning today to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Breonna Taylor, and what they stand for, and what that means in terms of our society.
Absolutely. And as you're describing your perspective on the Breonna Taylor case, you're reminding me of examples in the Talmud where the rabbis do just what you're saying. They say you can't look at what happens in this moment. You have to look at what people will naturally and obviously and understandably do generally in the world because of other forces. And that's what we want to address rather than the situation. And there's a very famous, one of my favorite passages, I know I say that a lot, but really one of my favorite passages that gets exactly at that, about gets and the rights of what men can do, what the Torah allows them to do, and how, because of the position of women in society at that time,
A get and a get is a divorce.
A divorce, yeah. So when we get, soon we should go there,
Mm-hmm.
because your perspective is really helping me understand what they do there. They use svara to address the underlying situation.
Mm.
It's, yeah,
Okay.
thank you. And we'll probably make reference to Ruth Bader Ginsburg over and over, because the Talmud is always doing what she did. It's trying to sell an innovation, to get people on board to something that they wouldn't immediately be on board for, in emotional, clever, tricky, whatever ways. And we're going to see that in every single text we do, including today's.
Well, and here's something that I think, is a segue into our text. I've been trying to make sense of what's bothered me a little bit about some of the hosannas directed towards Ruth Bader Ginsburg by particularly conservative men, and I don't need to name names, but some really beautiful things being said about her, and specifically about her work on equality for women. And I kind of want to ask those men two things, like, but you were probably on the other side of that in the 70s when she was doing her work, or if you weren't really hadn't yet come of age, you probably would have been had you. Now you could tell the story, oh, I wouldn't, but people like you were on the wrong side of that, number one. And number two, doesn't it strike you that if here's a woman who was a prophet, sort of saw before her time, or at least a lot of people saw it, at least figured out how to make it happen. And do you think that was the only thing that she was right about? I mean, like what I'm trying to say is, like, given the fact that she now disagrees with you on a laundry list of deep societal dysfunctions that she also believes is, like the lack of equality for women, equally dysfunctional, including racism and other topics. Like, maybe you should give her, a little listen there. Like it's something, and I think that comes to this question of, the that if we read the Talmud, for example, this text that we're looking at now, which is basically about whether and when the saving of a life, or the refusal to kill somebody overcomes all the laws of the Torah, and the Talmud basically says it does, with three exceptions that we'll talk about today. That's not, that one way to read that is, yeah, the Talmud makes an exception for, or Judaism makes an exception for saving a life. You want to talk about climate change today? You want to talk about racism today? Oh, it doesn't really have anything to say about that. For better or worse, like, climate change wasn't an issue at the time of the Talmud. So we don't know what Judaism says about climate change. We don't know what Judaism says about racism. So, that has to be in the realm of outside of Judaism. And I don't buy that for a minute. That's similar to saying that Ruth Bader Ginsburg only stands for opposition to sexism. No, first of all, Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself had opinions about, race and things like that. So we could say there, I'm saying to these conservative men, like, maybe listen to her on that as well. But what if a topic comes up, 5 years from now? Well, we don't know what Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have said about. Yeah, we do. We do. And so when I think about climate change, for example, in the Talmud that would be written today, it would say, if the climate was going to be destroyed, and therefore the world was going to be destroyed, and therefore, everybody was going to die, obviously that falls into the same category. So,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's a great segue into our text, except I want one more sidebar, which is, the rabbis invented this new system of sources, right? They inherit a system in which the only place you could figure out what God wants us to do is Torah. Beyond that, our hands are tied. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing in our text today is the rabbis actually going beyond what the Torah allows them, right? And just like the late Menachem Elon, the great scholar of Jewish law, says, all innovation is driven by svara, by moral intuition. But the rabbis sort of institutionalized 4 more sources, svara being one of them, precedent being one, custom, and legislation, in addition to Torah. And, I named my yeshiva svara because I think that source, that idea, needs to be lifted up in the world, and I think it's extraordinarily powerful. But over the years, as I've learned Talmud, I've come to realize that svara as a source of law is actually not the most powerful, and I referenced this once or twice before. I think last week. It's actually custom. It's what the people are doing, because what the people are doing establishes the reality on the ground that those who are going to legislate can then draw from, and then say, this is already happening and it's not destroying the world. Look, it's making the world a better place. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about with regard to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I haven't wanted to write or talk about it publicly because it looks like it draws attention away from her, and I don't want to do that at this moment, but I don't think it does. But here's what it is. It's what I understand of her evolution and where she got to the place she got to as a person creating new legislation for women and other people. And that was that she was pushed by her students. She was pushed by the feminists in her law school classes that were not about, the classes weren't about women in the law. Classes were about contracts and other things. And her women students, who were much further along than she was on feminism and women's rights and activism, they were saying, hey, why, this is what we need to be doing. And she was like, oh, wow. And then she started reading and learning and created a course. And it was a perfect, for me, that was an example of how minhag pushes law. And, her gift was hearing the minhag, was listening to what's going on. And her arguments, as far as I understand them in those early cases to the circuit court and the tax case, her argument was, we're not changing reality. Reality has already changed. We're only bringing law into line with what people believe rightfully is true. So anyway, that was just something that...
Well, I wonder whether when it comes down to it, and maybe this is something we could pursue over time, whether there are actually really only 2 sources of law. The ancient law, we could call that Torah, Constitution, something that maybe legislation after a while, something that firms up, and svara, which is a deep moral intuition. And for example, minhag, custom, to the extent that it's different from what the law says, it's actually an exhibiting of the svara of the people.
That's right.
In the world. And so it actually is svara, just in a different veneer.
That's exactly right. And I think legal scholars call it anonymous legislation. It is the aggregate of the people who are not involved in changing law itself, but it's living out their svara, and then the legislators looking at that and going, yeah, you're right. That's svara operating on a popular, as in people, level.
So when we look at this passage, this part of the Talmud that we're looking at, and actually it's kind of looking like we're going to be in this area for a while, because it's a very rich couple of pages of Talmud. And it's not only rich because there's some interesting stories there, it's rich because it's really showing it's really giving us an example of this process of working through when does our sense that what's written in the Torah can't be the full law. What do we do at that when we have that intuition? And fundamentally, I think that we in the modern world are dealing with precisely that intuition today, where and by the way, a lot of that is being exhibited through what we could call minhag, like the actions of the people. In this case, their action is that they're not too interested in what the law says, what the Talmud says, or what they perceive the Talmud says, because it doesn't seem relevant to them, and they say, well, you say Judaism doesn't have anything to say about climate change, or if you do, you're going to pull out some random quote, about, planting trees. Like, that's not, where the reality is it has a tremendous amount to say. And what they're basically saying is that, our gut sense is that this can't be the whole thing. And so then I think it becomes the job of the leaders to go, whether they're the pre-existing leaders from before or some new group of leaders, to get into an attic and say, actually the people are right. I think about particularly a high holiday season, so much of the time that we're at least used to this idea that that's the opportunity for the rabbis to tell the people what they're getting wrong, and how they're not living up to Judaism, because they're all there for the high holiday, so they have a chance to do a little bit of finger wagging. But what if the reaction was the opposite? And this year, there's a certain way in which it is, right? Because this year, because the people and the rabbis can't do it the old way, all of a sudden, all these synagogues are doing things they never would have imagined doing before, like having services online on a holiday, that they don't use electricity, for example, and they're doing it because, for all kinds of reasons, like it has to be done. And so it's an interesting example of a time where you take kind of, well, this is what the people are doing. This is what the people need. The people aren't going to stand for us saying we're not having services this year. They're not going to stand for saying, like, we're not having Yisker and you can't say Yisker for your departed ones, even though this is the one time a year that you do it. That's just not going to fly. And so the leaders, in this case, the previous leaders, are coming and saying, we're going to come towards you. We're going to be the ones to make some modifications. And in this case, it's sort of the new leaders saying, we're going to get it. We're going to have to do some revisions here.
Yeah. You know what you're bringing to mind for me? As we as a family are struggling along with, I suppose, pretty much everyone in the world right now with distance learning and the challenges of that for kids and families, I've become aware of something called trauma-informed learning. And it's basically a lens which has existed out there for educational settings, primarily for kids who are in trauma for whatever reason. And now every kid's in trauma, right? This is probably the most traumatic thing, God willing, many of these kids will ever deal with in their lives. And it's ongoing. And the educational lens, according to this school of thought, is we have to re-ask ourselves, what are the needs of these kids right now? And, learning algebra is pretty far down the line right now. And unless we take care of, a la Maslow, unless we take care of their emotional and mental health needs, we're not going to even get to algebra. And that's what schools need to be doing. And often schools are sort of offloading that. Why do I bring that up? Because I forget what it was that you said, but when it had to do with a re-asking of the question, what do we need right now? Oh yeah, you're talking about Rosh Hashanah and services. And the question is, what are the questions we need to answer right now? What are the needs we need to address right now? And those need to drive the design of how we do holidays, how we understand the holidays, or any sort of religious practices or technologies. And, in my crash cycle, that's when you go option 3, you revisit the driving questions and you ask yourself, what questions not only were we supposed to be answering, but did we never think we needed to answer? And now we have new needs, new questions, and those have to drive innovation. Anyway.
Yeah. No, great. So let's start kind of getting into the text. I just to remind folks. I mean, again, this is the question. The question that's arising here is whether the saving of a life or the refusal to take a life overcomes other Torah prohibition. So if somebody says, for example, eat a ham sandwich or I'll kill you, or then you should eat the ham sandwich. If they and that's true of every, according to the rabbis who are in this attic, which we talked about last week. Why was it in an attic? I think there's some interesting possibilities there. But so the rabbis are saying that any you can transgress any Torah prohibition other than 3: idol worship, forbidding either. So if somebody says worship this idol or I'll kill you, you should be killed and not worship the idol. We're about to see some exceptions to that. Or engage in certain forbidden sexual relations, or to kill somebody else. So if somebody says, if you have to kill this person or I'll kill you, you should allow yourself to be killed and not to kill another person. So those are basically those are the 3 exceptions. And now we want to start to see how they deal with the exceptions, right? You want to say any more?
Well, I just want to note that the text has hit you with the climax of the movie right here. This is it. This is the scene and the moment when the law is determined that you can violate, quote unquote, you can do what would have been considered a violation of the Torah in any circumstance, in any way, on any issue, in order to save a life or to prevent death. With these 3 exceptions, no justifications are given, no sources are given. The rabbis don't seem to feel the need in that moment of legislation in Nietzsche's attic to justify their answer. And this is typical of what you see in Jewish law in sort of the immediate post-crash era. You see this radical, bold, brief, unjustified legislation. And then in subsequent eras, you see the going back, revisiting, and filling in. Oh yeah, we should do that because of this reason or because of that reason. And they're both creating reason and sort of excavating from history other conversations where reasons were given. And we're going to see that conversation, or we're going to see that excavation and addition of rationales and reasons. And I'm still not sure what to make of this move in Jewish jurisprudence. And I'm not sure where we are in the world. I think we're in the bold, unjustified sort of Mishnaic era, but I think it's really interesting. And you and I have surmised, like tried to figure out, and when we have scholars on, we're always asking them, what was going on in the time of the later strata that either created the need for justification or made it. So anyway, just wanted to note that. So we had this first bold, unjustified, no reasons given statement, and now we're going to get into the messiness. Okay,
so we go on. Concerning those prohibitions, one must allow himself to be killed rather than transgress them, meaning those 3 that we just listed. Those are ones that that you shouldn't do, even if you're going to be killed. So the Gemara asks, and should one not transgress the prohibition of idol worship to save his life? But isn't it taught in a Braita, which is another ancient text around the same time as the Mishnah, but isn't it taught that Rabbi Yishmael said, from where is it derived that if a person is told worship idols and you will not be killed, from where is it derived that he should worship the idol and not be killed? The verse states, you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which a person shall do, and he shall live by them. So that's actually something that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, where the main justification that was ultimately derived at for why you should save a life, like meaning taking medicine or that kind of thing, even if it would be prohibited on Shabbat, is this exact phrase that the Torah says you should live by them, meaning you shouldn't die by these commandments. So even worshiping an idol, right? So Rabbi Yishmael is saying thereby teaching that the mitzvot were given to provide life, but they were not given so that one will die due to their observance.
So I think this is super interesting, because what the Stama, the editor, is surfacing here is basically saying, you know what, it wasn't always this clear. For whatever reason, which I'm not sure, the Stama wants to surface the fact that there was another opinion. Who is this? Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael, who says, actually, there should be only two exceptions, I think we should presume. And idol worship shouldn't be one of those things that you should die for. If some, evil ruler says, bow down to this idol or else I'll kill you, bow down to the idol.
Mm-hmm.
And save your life. So it seems like Rabbi Ishmael would only have had two exceptions, and the Stama's surfacing that. Okay, that's interesting.
Right. So okay, so we'll continue. So the Breita continues. This story of Rabbi Ishmael continues. One might have thought that it is permitted to worship the idol in this circumstance even in public, that is, in the presence of many people. Therefore, the verse states, neither shall you profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. That's from Leviticus. So the Steinsaltz's explanation here is evidently one is not required to allow himself to be killed so as not to transgress the prohibition of an idol worship when in private, but in public, he must allow himself to be killed rather than transgress. So as I understand it here, what they're bringing here is saying, yes, the Torah does say, v'chai bahem, you should live by these commandments, but there is a specific additional statement in the Torah that says that that you shouldn't profane God's name. So that's kind of a trump even over that one. So there's a hierarchy of Torah quotes here.
Yeah, so I'm actually understanding this in a clearer way than I ever have before. It looks like what the editor is doing is he's reworking Rabbi Ishmael to have meant not that we should, it's not this very obvious contradiction to what they decided in Nitzah, but only an allowance of idol worship in private.
Uh-huh.
In public, no, but in private, yes, which is probably not fair to Rabbi Ishmael. He probably meant both. And I'd say he certainly meant both, meaning he certainly meant to allow both public and private idol worship rather than allowing oneself to be killed. But nevertheless, even with this limitation, we end up with a modification of the Nitzah's Attic law, which is now the exception of idol worship, meaning something for which you should allow yourself to be killed, now only applies in public. Mm-hmm. So, and the text doesn't go on here, but later in the Gemara, where we won't continue, not only limits but don't let yourself be killed to do idol worship to a case in public, it limits it to the leader of a community. Okay, if you're the leader of a community, only then. If you're just an everyday person, bow down. But if you're the leader of a community, don't bow down in public. Don't bow down if it's in public. And then it limits it further by saying, okay, if you're the leader of a community and they tell you to bow down to an idol in public, do it to save your life. Only don't do it if it's a time of persecution. Mm-hmm. So they've limited down that even the exception of idol worship to only for leaders of communities, only for public, only for times of persecution, only in that situation would it be a desecration of God's name to do this, and therefore do it all those times with this one exception. Only then should you allow yourself to be killed rather than do it. Okay. So
yeah, and I just think that that's really interesting, and this is often not the way the Talmud is taught, because we tend to teach it as if it all happens in one moment. But it's interesting to wonder if it could have been that there were historical circumstances that changed between the time of the initial conversation in Nitzah's attic, if that was real, and not just a legend. But if there was some change in circumstances where your hypothetical case
Mhm.
actually turns into a real case, and you realize, wait a second, like we're going to have too many Jews being killed if we continue this way. Maybe there wasn't so much, you know, times when people were saying, you should be killed, or worship an idol or you'll be killed or something, and they were like, well, that's more of a hypothetical. But now there's persecutions and it's a real concern. So we say, well, we better limit that. Or, what else might have been happening
Yeah,
historically?
that's really interesting. Both what else might have been happening and who else, who now is in on the legislative process,
Right.
who's
Right.
more in touch with what's really happening and really gets right. I mean, when the voices of people who are, for example, seeing what police are really doing,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
involved, right, in being able to communicate out to the world the reality, we start to get a public conversation about defunding the police.
Yeah.
Whereas that same reality was happening before, but those people who understood the dangers of a militarized police force, you know, playing out racism, they didn't have a public voice or weren't being listened to. So I think you're absolutely right.
No, and I love that, and that actually is a beautiful tie to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because I'm thinking in particular about the Lilly Ledbetter case, which was the pay discrimination case. If you just there was a woman who only late in her career did she discover that she was actually being paid much less compared to her male contemporaries in similar positions, and she sued, and the Supreme Court basically held that the time had run out on the claim. That it was a statute of limitations, and so she couldn't get justice, even though she had a right to, basically, but her time had run out. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who at the time was the only woman on the Supreme Court, because Sandra Day O'Connor had already retired and Sotomayor and Kagan had not yet been put on, she basically writes this dissent where she says, fundamentally, that her male colleagues just don't understand what it's like to be a woman in the workforce. And this all sounds well and good theoretically. As a statute of limitations, it's important to have a statute of limitations, because otherwise people can't ever know that they're okay, and that they're, and they're always worrying that they're going to be, there's all this, like you were saying, there's all this like analytics that makes sense, but it actually doesn't correspond to reality. And you can only really understand that reality by having people who are part of that reality be among the judges, so to speak, or the leaders, right? And I think that, by the way, like it was certainly true about LGBTQ Jews, and Svara has done a tremendous work over the last decade or two, other organizations as well, about making it so that there are more LGBTQ Jews in those kind of positions. I think about Jews of color today, because I think about how, us white Jews, we're all of course, we're against racism. And so we would definitely agree to various rules that said no racism. But there's probably so many areas, I mean, not probably, there are definitely so many areas in which we don't see the racism that's there, and we wouldn't even recognize that what we're talking about is even racism. Once you start to change who is on the court, so to speak, who is in a leadership position, who's studying Talmud, then you start to, like you said, the donkey stories, then people start to recognize themselves in a certain way in the old stories, and they recognize themselves in a way that says, hey, maybe I recognize myself as the donkey in more ways than one, meaning I'm the victim of, I'm the person that people are writing, like this is not a good story. We need to flip this story, and that happens only over the course of time. And I think also about Martin Luther King and the idea of taking the really a document in the Constitution that and the Declaration of Independence, which was hypocritical, and the Constitution, which was offensive, to Black people. And Martin Luther King basically, nevertheless, saying, I'm going to take the principle that all men are created equal, and I'm going to make a claim on you, white America, and say, like, I don't believe that you meant to write us a bad check. I refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. So I'm going to use your moral intuition, your decision that you stated in a general case with a hypothetical that turned out to be, real, that was actually very bad. But I'm going to come back and say, you know what, it's the moral case was right, the hypothetical was bad, or the real thing was bad. Now let's actually take it to where it needs to go. And that's a kind of process that I see going on here.
Yeah. And I think that's the genius of the Talmudic process as well. That's what the rabbis are doing. They're saying, Um, our svara has always, I think the rabbis actually understand the Torah to be a product of svara.
Yes.
And yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there. I think you're
Well,
absolutely right.
well, the one thing is that we were talking the other day, and you reminded me about how you're always saying that, like, sometimes we'll learn a text like this in Svara, and students will come up to you and say, like, you've convinced me with your take. I mean, like, but how does this get taught in, like, an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva where they don't believe in this, like, evolving process, and that they imagine, again, that moment in time idea is really how they think about it. And so if they would read something like this, not as a, evolution of this idea over the course of time when new people came into positions of leadership and they recognized, that, how do they learn this? And I think it's a really important question, and it's worth, kind of exploring the different ways that different communities might look at this same text. But at least to me, it's as clear as day that what we're looking at here, and what I appreciate the rabbis not hiding from us, the rabbis who wrote the Talmud, the rabbis who have been teaching the Talmud have been hiding it. But the rabbis who wrote the Talmud weren't hiding that there was an original point where there was a broad category of exceptions given to this rule. And at a later point, that exception got narrowed, meaning, and just to make it clear, that when the exception is narrowed, that means that the broad rule is widened. So what that means is that they're saying there's even more times when the not taking a life is going to trump the Torah, and so that's what's going on here. And they're showing us their hand. They're showing us that that's happening.
Exactly. And, we call Svara traditionally radical yeshiva, really, rather than a queer yeshiva. We debated for a long time about what goes after the colon.
Uh-huh.
And really what drives our perspective more than the queer lens is the traditionally radical lens. It's the lens which recognizes that the rabbis wanted us to see that. The shapers of this text wanted us to see this process at work so that we could replicate it on whatever issue was relevant in our own time, but in that way. And the tragedy of the Talmud, which Svara exists to reverse, is that it's been missed. That recognition of that the fact that the rabbis are trying to show us that has been lost,
Mm-hmm.
and a kind of pietistic take has been used. The effect of that has been
Exacerbated.
Thank you.
Exacerbated.
Right. Thank you. And I'm exasperated, so I'm confusing the two. By the limitation on who gets to be in the room
Mm-hmm.
to see what's going on, right? Which gets to the point we made before. So yeah. When it's missed, it's the power of the Talmud is actually lost, and the text is then misused and abused. Anyway.
Yeah, no, and I've been looking at the high holidays lately, because we've been studying various texts relating to the high holidays, and, like, what struck me so much this year is that a lot of the sources in the Torah that are imagined to be the sources for high holiday practices actually don't say that in the Torah. So, for example, the story in the Torah about the lamb being sent off to Azazel, the scapegoat. I guess not a lamb, it's a goat, but the scapegoat story and everything, and we know of this as the practice for Yom Kippur in the temple. Well, maybe it was in the late Second Temple period, but it doesn't say that in the Torah. The Torah actually doesn't say anything about connecting that practice to Yom Kippur directly. There's indirectly, because the next thing it talks about is Yom Kippur, but it doesn't say, and this is the practice for Yom Kippur. It's just that the next comment is about Yom Kippur. So it's assumed, and actually what it seems to have to do with is the death of Aaron's sons in the tabernacle, and Tumat Metim, the impurity of the dead, is one of the worst impurities. And so we got to get it out of the tabernacle. So we have this elaborate ritual. Now, I think eventually that was said, well, like, we have to do that once a year to clear the temple out from the impurities on Yom Kippur. Fine, but it doesn't actually say that in the Torah. And nobody recognizes that because we've been taught to read it oh, well, now here comes the practice for Yom Kippur, and we recognize it. And we, when Isaiah in the Haftorah reading for Yom Kippur says, the famously, God, in God's voice, I hate your fast days, if you oppress the poor, right? We're taught to see that, what he's saying is that God hates Yom Kippur if you oppress the poor, but actually the Torah doesn't say the fast on Yom Kippur. So, the whole thing is like we get taught to learn it through a certain lens. And that's, I think, my experience of the Talmud is that the lens that I was taught to read it through in a more traditional setting just doesn't survive actual reading. And you can say that we can only read, we're only allowed to read, I guess, through the lens of the commentators, but okay, but at least, but you can say, well, because they were inspired by God, or they knew the right way. I don't know. But I mean, it's a powerful experience when you actually read the text and you see what it actually says.
Yeah. And the fact that we conflate, or we believe so deeply the myth created to insert new meaning into the traditional practices is both fabulous and powerful and wonderful, and also a real danger when those practices stop working, because we then think, oh, that it's always been that way, therefore it can't be changed. So it cuts both ways, right? When
right.
We have to kind of make that wink to create a bit of a false history to give it power, but that power and the success of the wink make it really difficult unless you can excavate enough to show the lines between the jigsaw puzzle pieces that it actually was constructed and can be deconstructed and put together in a different way.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump back into the text.
Okay.
So the Gemara answers, those in the upper story of the house of Nitza, in Nitza's attic that we've been talking about, the folks who originally made these three exceptions and made the general statement that not killing somebody trumps the Torah. Those in the upper story of the house of Nitza stated their opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, as it's taught in a Breita that Rabbi Eliezer says. So this is a different place that Rabbi Eliezer, again, another one of these early rabbis, stated, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. If it is stated with all your soul, why is it also stated with all your might, which indicates with all your material possessions? And if it is stated with all your might, why is it stated with all your soul? One of these seems to be superfluous. So this is like from the Shema, b'chol levavcha, v'chol nefshecha, v'chol meodecha, that you should love the Lord, and it kind of has this like repetitive, with everything you have. One way to read it is just as with everything you have, and that's just sort of poetic. But the Talmud doesn't like the idea that the Torah is using extraneous words, so they're saying, okay, well, why didn't it either say with everything you have? That's one way it could have said it, or it could have said with all your might, or it could have said with all your soul, but it didn't have to say with all your might and with all your soul. So they're trying to figure out here.
And I would just say, before we get at the teasing apart of the apparent superfluity, that verse itself that Rabbi Eliezer put forth is basically saying, love God with, like you say, everything you have, including your life. That is understood generally as the source for even give up your life in order to establish that God, our God, and not those other gods, is the one to worship. Okay, so there's the source that the Talmud is saying for don't bow down to another idol, even if it costs you your life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so but now it's digging into the specifics of that verse, because the rabbis use apparent redundancies to create new meanings, and here come these new meanings. Okay,
so one of these clauses seems to be superfluous. Rather, it's not superfluous. This serves to teach that if you have a person whose body is more precious to him than his property, it's therefore stated with all your soul. That person must be willing to sacrifice even his life to sanctify God's name. And if you have a person whose property is more precious to him than his body, it is therefore stated with all your might. That person must be prepared to sacrifice all his property for the love of God. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, one must allow himself to be killed rather than worship an idol. So if I understand this correctly, like Rabbi Ishmael's would suggest that there's this exception for that it only applies if you're being asked to worship an idol publicly, and Rabbi Eliezer is saying in all cases of idol worship you should sacrifice your life. And at this point, the Talmud is saying apparently the people in the attic were on Rabbi Eliezer's side, where they said in any case.
You know what? I'm honestly not sure whether Rabbi Eliezer's verse here and the rabbis in Nitz's attic going with Rabbi Eliezer imply that the exception of in public for a leader at a time of persecution, those exceptions don't apply. I don't think so. I think it's merely that Rabbi Eliezer is asserting that, unlike Rabbi Ishmael, who says, bow down to an idol rather than give up your life, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, don't bow down. Give up your life rather than do that. I think the exceptions Rabbi Eliezer would still hold. I'm not 100% sure. But what the Gemara is continuing to do in parsing out this seeming redundancy is they're saying, you know what? There are actually all kinds of people. And the reason the Torah goes into with all your soul and with all your might and with all your what are the words? With all your life, with all your soul, with all your might, whatever, is because we need to be speaking to people who have different priorities. And there actually might be people out there whose possessions are more important to them than their lives, and they'd be willing to give up their lives to save their possessions. It reminds me of the joke my father used to tell about, the old joke, your money or your life. Wait a minute, I'm thinking, that joke?
Right.
Right? So the guy who says, wait a minute, I'm willing to give up my life.
Right.
The Torah comes to say, even your might, even your stuff, even your money, you should be willing to, let's see, how does this work?
You should be willing to give up all your money rather than worship an idol.
Even if your money is more important to you than your life. Yeah, that's it.
Right.
So it's a bit addressing a different issue than it's like, even for all of you who don't value your lives very much. Okay. I'm having trouble.
Yeah, no. Okay. In my mind, what I'm thinking about is just like it's just even taking account of that argument that a person might come and say, well, you say that you shouldn't worship an idol if you're going to give up your life, but I mean you shouldn't you should give up your life rather than worship an idol. But what if like giving up my life is easy, but like giving up my property is hard? You're saying that right, that if I'm being forced to worship an idol, I should give up my property. But, it's just interesting that it sort of takes that case on. Yeah. All right, let's continue. Okay. So then the Talmud goes on to say,
wait a minute, there's some connection here. Okay, wait a minute. I think there's a connection here to white privilege. Okay. I think B'chol Me'odecha relates to white privilege. I'm not quite there, but it seems to have something to do with the recognition that people hold their goodies, with such even a subconscious force that they'd rather have people die than give up their good. There's something here. I can't quite figure it out yet, but there's something there.
Yeah. No, it's okay. A good point. Okay. Okay. I'm hearing that. So let's tease that out over time.
Okay.
Okay. So from where is it derived that one must allow himself to be killed rather than transgress the prohibition of forbidden sexual relations and the prohibition of bloodshed? This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, As it is taught in a Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, with regard to the rape of a betrothed young woman, it is written, but you shall do nothing to the young woman. The young woman has committed no sin worthy of death. For as when a man rises against his neighbor and slays him, so too with this matter, from Deuteronomy. But why would the verse mention murder in this context? But what do we learn here from a murderer? Now, the mention of murder came in order to teach a halacha, a law, about the betrothed young woman. And it turns out that in addition, it derives a halacha from that case. So we don't only learn about rape here, we're also learning about murder. The Torah juxtaposes the case of a murderer to the case of a rape of a betrothed young woman to indicate that just as in the case of a betrothed young woman, one may save her at the cost of the rapist's life, so too, in the case of a murderer, one may save the potential victim at the cost of the murderer's life. And conversely, the Torah juxtaposes a betrothed young woman to a murderer to indicate that just as with regard to a potential murderer, the halacha is that if one was ordered to murder another, he must be killed and not transgress the prohibition of bloodshed. So too, with regard to a betrothed young woman, if she is faced with rape, she must be killed and not transgress the prohibition of forbidden sexual relations.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say before we go any further is this last line is clarified by the Gemara later to make clear that the question never, ever has been, should a woman faced with rape give up her life rather than be raped? That, it looks like it's saying that, but that isn't what it says. It's, should the potential rapist give up his life rather than commit the rape? Okay, so I just want to make sure that's super clear. The tradition never, never entertains the possibility that it's preferable for a woman to die rather than, quote, allow herself to be raped. That's not at all what this is saying. Okay, so, but to back up into the proof, what the text seems to be now doing is going one by one into the other exceptions to what you should rather transgress rather than be killed, namely a certain set of sexual prohibitions and murder. Okay, and this is a really complicated proof, but in short, what it's saying is, since the discussion about a woman who is being raped in the field is juxtaposed, it's near in the Torah to the verse about the fact that you are permitted to kill someone who is the rodef, who is a pursuer in pursuit of murdering someone in order to save the life of the potential victim. And it's next to the conversation about the rapist. We can learn from the case of the pursuing potential murderer whom you're allowed to kill before he commits that act. So too, can you and must you, if you're able, kill the potential rapist before the rapist has a chance to do that rape? In other words, the committing of the rape is so severe that that rapist's life should be taken rather than he commit that act. Okay, so that's now understood to be the source for why it is preferable to give up your life than commit rape, not be raped, commit rape. Okay, great. Now, having established the proof for that, the Gemara goes on to ask, well, what's the actual source for the fact that you can kill someone who is out to murder someone else rather than allow the victim to be killed, but you may not actually murder an innocent person in order to save your own life? Yeah. Okay, okay, good.
Well, it seems like given the time that we should probably pick that up next week.
Okay, great.
So, just in summary, like what I'd say about this is that, like, what I think that we're trying to dig out here and to really take a deep dive into this particular piece of Talmud is ultimately it's like what we talked about. I think we might have mentioned this last week, but it's like what we talked about when we talked about the Oven of Achnai story, where what's really important is to imagine the modern day version of that story, and the characters change. So whereas in the story of the oven of Achnai, it's God who is saying, I know what the law is, and the majority says, but we don't have to listen to you. In this case, it's it's starting to be, well, but they said in the Nietzsche's Attic, our original rabbinic progenitors said, say, well, yeah, but like things have changed and we can really kind of make that more. And if we think about that today and we think about, well, and it might be that we say, well, racism or climate change, as the two examples that we've been talking about, well, those are like new. I mean, obviously they're not, well, climate change may be new, relatively speaking, for it's something that humans weren't really affecting the climate as much back then. Certainly there was racism in a different way, I guess. So that wasn't kind of modern racism. But the point of it all is that we could go really radical and say, today there are very important issues that may also trump Torah, or in this case, might trump Talmud, might trump rabbinic Judaism. But I'm not even sure that we have to go that far. I think that we can also use our svara, and here in actually the narrower sense of a logical deduction, and to say, well, when we're talking about killing, when we're saying that saving a life trumps the Torah prohibitions, or that the requirement not to kill trumps the Torah prohibitions, the narrow way to look at that is holding a gun to somebody's head and saying, shoot this person or I'll shoot you or whatever. But the much more important version of that is, if we destroy the earth, then everybody will die. If we allow racism to exist in a way that causes the deaths of Black people at a rate higher than the deaths of white people, whether that's because of shooting or because of healthcare, right? That at least we ought to consider whether those are actually just simple logical deductions that say, if we can save a life, by not, if we should do something that the Torah prohibits in order to save a life, when that choice is direct, then when that choice is indirect, we should also do it, especially when it's like obvious that that's going to happen and we don't even know which person is going to die as a result, but people are going to die. So therefore, if, for example, we have to, I don't know exactly, we could play out what would be the Torah prohibitions that you would have to violate in order to, but one of them, for example, is, we talked about last week, is gathering together for Yom Kippur services, if that's going to cause, a virus to spread, even if nobody in the room dies of it, but somebody else will die from it, right, because it's spreading, I think it's a pretty easy case, actually.
Yeah, and I think you've put your finger on precisely the power of what the Stama is doing in going back to early unjustified legislation and saying, here was the rationale. It's so that the later generations can't look at the legislation and go, oh, the only thing that we can do is violate all these laws, but these three you can't. You'd be blocked from expanding that if you didn't also have made transparent the rationale for arriving at those three exceptions. Once you have the rationale, it's an easy move from, oh, I could apply that same rationale to this quote unquote new idea, whether it's environmentalism or racism or feminine, you name it, because this rationale applies equally. And I can easily expand the tradition now because I know what drives the expansion. And you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. And if they hadn't sort of shown their work, it would have been a lot harder to figure out what to do when we reach a case where seemingly these laws are taking us in the wrong direction. And since they've shown us their work, so to speak, we're able to say, well, yeah, I'm not following the rule in this case, the substantive rule in this case. I'm following the process rule, which says, how do I think about this new case? And actually, somebody asked us recently about, are we going to have a show about climate change? And part of me, says, well, I think all of our shows are about climate change because they're fundamentally about saying this is the process that we use to think through something. The Talmud says a lot more about climate change through a text like this than whatever one or two texts we might dig up that say something nice about trees.
Exactly. People are always asking me, why don't you ever teach about homosexuality? And I'm like, I will never, ever teach Leviticus because you're looking at the whole issue wrong. If you think what the tradition has to say about, quote unquote, the gay issue lives in Leviticus. It lives in the entirety of the Talmud. Oh, I'm going to let you connect the dots. Every single one of these cases that were done 2,000 years ago provide a rationale for and a process and a methodology for, quote unquote, the gay issue or any other issue. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, to be continued. Cliffhanger. Okay. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Dan. This is fun.
Thanks, B'nai. Bye.
Bye.